In the large hall of the prestigious clinic, where everything glistened with sterile whiteness, Edward stopped at the receptionist's desk. His tall stature and strict suit made him a prominent figure, but his face showed fatigue and irritation. In his hands he held a small bouquet of white roses, barely wrapped in a simple package. "Laura Evans's room," he said dryly, avoiding eye contact with the young nurse behind the counter. "Third wing, fifth door on the left, Mr. Evans," she replied with the smile she was used to seeing in patients like him, concerned but secretive relatives of patients. Edward nodded, not even thanking her, and headed toward the stairs. He'd always avoided the lift. The cramped space and inappropriate conversations with strangers made him cringe. In the silence of the stairwell he could gather his thoughts. As he walked up the stairs, Edward thought about how much his life had changed in the last 3 months. Laura, his wife, whom he had once considered his support and inspiration, was now lying in a coma. All this time the doctors had been keeping her alive with machines, and the medical bills were mounting at an alarming rate. Each new day at the clinic reminded Edward of how expensive his care was becoming. His steps slowed. He knew that today would be more than just the familiar scene of Laura lying motionless in her hospital bed and the monotonous sound of the machines. Her parents were going to visit her today, and that was always a challenge. He had to play the inconsolable husband, hiding the irritation and anger that was slowly eating away at him from the inside. How much longer is this going to go on? Edward thought, clutching the stems of the roses with his fingers. Every day in this hospital was costing him not only money, but also his nerves. He realized that his image of a caring husband was important to those around him. No one could suspect that behind that facade lurked a very different intention. When he reached the room, the door was ajar. Edward heard muffled voices inside. It was Laura's parents, Caroline and Richard. Their tones were hopeful, but there were tears in Caroline's voice. "The doctor says she can hear us," Caroline sobbed. "We have to keep talking to her, tell her we're here, that we're waiting for her." "Of course, darling," Richard reassured her. "Laura's strong, she'll get through this. We have to have faith." Edward rolled his eyes. This naive talk only irritated him. He didn't share their belief in miracles. For him, Laura had long been an obstacle he couldn't get rid of. Her condition, her medical bills, her need to constantly pretend to care, all these things only served to increase his irritation. He entered the room, wearing a mask of grief. Caroline noticed him at once and nodded a greeting, and Richard stood up to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming, Edward," he said. "You're a real husband, always there for me." "I'm just doing what I have to do," Edward said with ostentatious humility as he walked over to Laura's bed. He placed the bouquet on the table beside her and stood for a moment, staring at her pale face. In the back of his mind, the only thing he felt was annoyance that Laura was still here. "How is she?" he asked without turning round. "The doctor said there's a slight improvement," Caroline replied with hope in her voice. "Did you hear that, Edward? She can hear us. We have to talk to her." Edward could hardly contain a dismissive chuckle. It seemed to him that there was no point in this conversation. "Of course," he replied dryly. "I'll be with her." When Laura's parents left, leaving Edward alone with his wife, he sat down in the chair beside the bed. The room was quiet, with only the rhythmic sound of the machine keeping Laura alive. Edward leaned closer, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Laura," he began, barely concealing his irritation. "I don't know if you can hear me or not. But I have to say it. How much longer is this going to go on? Do you realize how much this is costing? If you could just walk away, it would be easier." His words cut through the silence like a knife. He didn't notice that on the other side of the room, outside the door, someone was listening intently to his every word. Edward sat at Laura's bedside, his gaze darting between her still face and the machine that was counting the steady rhythm of her pulse. His heart was beating faster than usual, but not from worry or regret. He was tormented by an anger he couldn't keep inside any longer. "You've always been strong, Laura," he began, leaning slightly toward her. You had the strength to keep everything under control, the business, our relationship. Me. And now? He grinned bitterly. Now you're defenseless, and all that power means nothing. His voice became quieter, almost a whisper. And you know what's most hurtful? Everything you have, I never owned it. Not the company, not the money. And I deserve it. I've been there for you, supporting you. He fell silent when he heard a muffled rustle somewhere behind the door. His face tensed. Edward got up and walked slowly to the door, opening it slightly. There was no one in the corridor, only the distant sounds of conversations and footsteps of staff. Showing, he thought as he returned to his seat. At this time, in the neighboring wing of the clinic, 10-year-old Martin, a patient with a rare heart condition, was peering out from around the corner. He often wandered the corridors, ignoring the nurse's strict prohibitions. For him, the clinic was something like a labyrinth, full of secrets. Today his attention was drawn to the ward where Laura was lying. Martin moved closer to the door when he heard Edward's voice. He couldn't make out everything, but the words "leave" and "cost" made him wary. The child's curiosity took over and he lurked close by, trying not to make any noise. Who is this man? Why does he say that? Martin thought, clutching his favorite toy, a stuffed rabbit, tighter to him. Meanwhile, Edward continued talking, unaware that his words had become someone else's ears. I'm not even sure I want you to wake up. Can you imagine? He grinned hoarsely. If you wake up suddenly, you'll start controlling me again, telling me how things should be. And I want my freedom. I want to control what's mine. He sank back in his chair, sighing heavily. I'm not going to pay for this forever, Laura. It's your parents who may believe in miracles, but I'm a realist. His voice came out louder than he meant it to, and there was a low creak from behind the door. Edward turned his head sharply. Who's there? He threw into the void, but there was no answer. He didn't like the feeling of someone watching him. His gaze was sharp as a predator's, but the door remained closed and the corridor beyond it empty. Edward decided not to pay any attention to it, though an uneasiness crept into his chest. Martin backed away hastily, cradling the rabbit against his chest. He'd heard enough to know that the man at Laura's bedside didn't care about her at all. Childish curiosity quickly gave way to fear, but Martin knew he had to tell someone. He ran towards the office of Dr. Hunter, one of the men who had always been kind to him. Hunter often talked to Martin, trying not only to treat him but also to support him emotionally. Today the boy came running to the doctor, all excited. Dr. Hunter. He blurted out of breath. I heard a man saying terrible things about Mrs. Evans. Hunter looked up from the papers he was reviewing. His attentive gaze instantly grasped the seriousness of the situation. Calm down, Martin. What did you hear? Tell me everything, but in order. Martin began to tell the story, stumbling over the words but conveying the gist. The doctor listened attentively, his face growing more and more tense. Thank you, Martin, Hunter said softly when the boy had finished. You did the right thing in telling me. But now you need to go back to your room. I'll deal with it. When Martin had gone, Dr. Hunter sat for a long time, pondering what he had heard. He was disturbed by the information, but he realized that he had to proceed with caution. Edward had always seemed strange, but he was respected at the clinic for his devotion to his wife. Now these words. The doctor decided he had to do his own investigation to find out what was going on in Laura's room. This time he would not let the case remain in the shadows. Dr. Hunter closed the office door, still mulling over Martin's words. The situation seemed odd and needed attention. He decided to talk to Edward personally to get to the bottom of it. The man always seemed polite, though his demeanor was sometimes tense. But if Martin wasn't exaggerating. Edward had already left Laura's room. He walked down the corridor, avoiding eye contact with the staff. His thoughts swirled around the noise he had heard. He was sure someone was eavesdropping on him, and it was throwing him off balance. His plan required caution, and little things like this could ruin everything. He stepped out into the clinic's courtyard, where an elderly woman, Laura's mother, Mrs. Evans, was sitting on a bench. When she saw Edward, she rose hastily, her eyes shining with hope. "Edward, how is she? Did she react to your words? Did she hear you?" she asked, clasping her hands in front of her. Edward froze for a moment, then smiled tiredly. "Unfortunately, there's no change yet, Mrs. Evans. But the doctors are doing everything they can." Her eyes darkened, and she sighed heavily. "Thank you for being there for me, Edward. You've been a support to her always. We're so hopeful that she'll come back to us." Edward nodded, not taking his eyes off her face. These conversations with Laura's parents were weighing on him. They were too naive, and worse, they trusted him. "Excuse me, Mrs. Evans, I need to step out for a moment," he said, avoiding continuing the conversation. She nodded and escorted him out, not noticing how quickly the pretense of concern disappeared from his face as he turned round. Meanwhile, Dr. Hunter looked into Laura's room. He stopped at the bedside, looked carefully at the monitors, and examined her condition. Everything was stable, but something in Martin's story made him alert. He stood in silence, trying to figure out what exactly could have been going on here when no one was there. Suddenly a quiet voice sounded behind him. "Dr. Hunter?" He turned round and saw Pauline, the nurse who was often on duty outside Laura's room. She looked worried. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard Mr. Edward arguing with someone the other day. It was one of the administration staff. I thought he was being overly aggressive." She lowered her voice. "He was talking about money and complaining that the whole thing was dragging on." Hunter frowned, his suspicions heightened. He realized he had to proceed carefully to avoid causing a scandal. "Thank you, Pauline. If you notice anything else unusual, let me know right away," he said, trying to speak calmly. She nodded and walked out, leaving the doctor alone. He realized that the evidence was circumstantial, but he couldn't ignore it. Later that afternoon, Edward returned to Laura's room. His gaze was intense, but he tried to appear tired and caring. He sank into a chair by the bed, staring intently at her face. "Well, Laura," he began in a whisper, leaning closer. "It seems we have more and more witnesses. Even here, you're leaving me no room for maneuver." His face turned cold. "You've always been good at manipulating people, Laura. Even now, lying here, somehow you're still in my way." Suddenly he heard a faint sound from behind the door. It could have been some of the staff or patients again. Edward fell silent, looking around, then went to the door, but found no one. Turning back to the bed, he muttered, "We must be more careful." Meanwhile, Martin had gone to see Dr. Hunter again. His little heart was beating more often than usual, but he felt he must do something about it. "Dr. Hunter," he began, entering the office. That man was at Mrs. Evans's again. He was talking to her, well, as if he wanted her not to wake up. The doctor looked at the boy carefully. Martin's words were too serious for a child's imagination. "Thank you, Martin," he said, putting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You've been a great help to me. I promise I'll look into it." In the evening Hunter had a long conversation with Pauline and another employee. His goal was clear: to find out if video surveillance could be installed in Laura's room. Everything he'd heard spoke of the need to gather evidence. No one wanted to act openly, but something in Edward's behavior alarmed everyone around him. Edward returned to his flat in the late afternoon. He closed the door behind him, leaned back against it, and exhaled heavily. It had been a stressful day, and the feeling that he was under constant surveillance never left him. He tossed his keys on the table and headed for the bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Taking a swig, he set the glass down on the table with force. "It's impossible," he muttered, sitting down in the chair. "All these doctors, nurses. They only make my life harder." He picked up his phone and flicked through his contacts, stopping at the number written as D. He hesitated for a while, but dialed the number. A calm but slightly mocking voice came through the receiver. "You haven't called in a while, Edward. Is everything going according to plan?" "The plan?" he answered sharply. "There is no plan anymore. Those damn doctors see and hear everything. They suspect something." The voice on the other end of the line was silent for a moment. "Then you need to speed up. You know what to do. The more you procrastinate, the more likely you are to be discovered." Edward gripped the phone tightly. "I know. Just give me some time." "You don't have much time left, Edward. Do it." The connection went dead, and Edward threw the phone aside with force. He clutched his head, trying to calm down. Meanwhile, Dr. Hunter was meeting with the head doctor of the clinic. He outlined his suspicions and suggested installing a hidden camera in Laura's room. The head doctor frowned, listening intently. "Dr. Hunter," he began after a long pause. "This is a serious accusation. We have no direct evidence, only the boy's word and the staff's suspicions." "I understand," Hunter replied. "But if we don't do something, it could be irreparable. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prevent a possible threat." The chief physician thought about it for a long time, but finally agreed. "All right. Just be careful. If your suspicions aren't confirmed, it could hurt the clinic." Hunter nodded, inwardly relieved, and immediately began preparing to set up the camera. The next day Edward arrived at the clinic again. He entered Laura's room with a bouquet of roses, trying to look as calm as possible. His eyes met those of Nurse Pauline, who was standing at the monitors. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she said, in a slightly strained tone. "Good morning," he replied, barely managing to squeeze out a smile. "How is she today?" "No change," Pauline answered briefly and hurried out, not wanting to linger in the room. Edward sat down by the bed, put the flowers on the nightstand, and leaned closer to Laura. "You probably think I've lost," he whispered. "But I haven't. I'm still in control of the situation." He fell silent, listening. The room was quiet, but the feeling that he was being watched never left him again. He looked around, then leaned even closer. "If you'd just stay out of my way, Laura, things would be easier." Edward kept talking, not noticing the tiny camera flashing on the wall, almost hidden by the medical equipment. Dr. Hunter sat in his office, watching his laptop screen. He was keeping a close eye on what was happening in Laura's room. When Edward spoke, Hunter's face darkened. His suspicions were beginning to be confirmed. Pauline entered the office, carrying a folder of documents. "Anything new?" she asked, noticing the tension on the doctor's face. "Yes," he answered briefly, without taking his eyes off the screen. "This man is a real danger. We need to act quickly." Edward left the room an hour later, thinking that no one had suspected his intentions. He was already starting to formulate a new plan when he received a message from D. It was short, "Don't delay." His heart clenched. There was a decisive moment ahead, but he didn't know if he could follow through. Edward stopped in the clinic car park, lighting a cigarette. Inside him, everything was churning. The message from D sounded like an order he couldn't back down from. He felt cornered. Every step felt more and more like walking on a knife blade. Getting out of the car, he headed for the entrance. The receptionist looked at him with her usual, slightly strained smile. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she said. He nodded without slowing his step and walked up to Laura's room. In the corridor he bumped into Dr. Hunter. "Edward, you're early today," Hunter said, watching his reaction carefully. "I just thought I'd visit my wife," Edward replied coldly, trying to avoid a direct stare. "That was commendable. Family around is always important to a patient," Hunter said, nodding slightly. Edward sensed the tension in the doctor's words, but he didn't show his suspicions. He walked past, trying to look as calm as possible. Laura's room was quiet, only the slight noise of the machines breaking the silence. Edward walked over to the bed and put his hand on her cold palm. His gaze grew somber. Laura, you left me in a difficult situation, he began, as if his wife could hear him. If you only knew what you had to do to make things right. He looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was around, then leaned closer. But I'm gonna make it right, okay? You won't get in my way anymore. He was silent when he heard the door creak open. Pauline, the nurse, entered with a tray. Excuse me, Mr. Edward, I'm just checking the machines, she said, avoiding a direct look. Of course, he replied dryly, retreating to the window. Pauline looked at the equipment quickly, and as she left, she cast him a wary glance. Edward noticed this, which only made him more irritated. Meanwhile, Dr. Hunter was watching what was happening on the monitor. Pauline entered his office a few minutes later. Did he say something strange again? She asked, taking a seat next to him. Yes, Hunter nodded, turning down the sound so she couldn't hear the extraneous words. He's acting more and more suspicious. We have to be prepared for any eventuality. What are we going to do? Pauline looked worried. We have enough reason to call the police, but I want to wait for direct action. He needs to be caught with evidence. Pauline nodded, understanding the doctor's logic, though her fear for Laura wouldn't let her go. Edward came home in the late afternoon. He paced the room, pondering the best course of action. Every movement of Dr. Hunter and Nurse Pauline seemed suspicious to him. He pulled out his phone and dialed DS number again. You're procrastinating, came a familiar voice. These doctors know something. They're watching me, Edward replied sharply. They won't prove anything. Just do what you need to do, and this will all be over. And if things get out of control? Edward didn't hide his fear anymore. You have more to lose by procrastinating, the voice replied coldly. Tomorrow you'll finish everything. I'll make sure nothing goes wrong. Edward threw the phone on the couch, clenching his fists. He realized that he couldn't back down. The next morning, Edward was at Laura's room again. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He took a deep breath and walked over to the bed. This will be our last goodbye, he said quietly, leaning closer. This has all dragged on too long. I'm sorry. He raised his hand, heading towards the machine that was keeping Laura alive. At that moment, the door opened abruptly, and Dr. Hunter appeared on the threshold, along with the clinic security. Edward, step away from the equipment, Hunter said firmly. Edward froze in place, his hand trembling. What does that mean? He asked, trying to appear calm. We have seen and heard enough to understand your intentions, the doctor continued. You'd better explain everything to the police. Edward took a step back, but the guards had already blocked the exit. It's a misunderstanding, he began, but his voice trembled. A misunderstanding? Hunter replied coldly. Then you won't mind if we turn the tapes over to law enforcement. Edward realized he had no choice. He cast a quick glance at Laura, then shifted his gaze to the doctor. Just wanted to ease her suffering, he mumbled, but there was no conviction in his voice. The court will decide that, Hunter said, nodding to the guards. Take him away. The guards grabbed Edward by the arms, and he didn't resist any longer. The room was silent again. Hunter walked over to Laura's bed and looked at her carefully. We will protect you, Laura, he said quietly. No one will ever hurt you again. Outside the door, Pauline exhaled with relief. She realized that the fight was not over, but the first step to saving Laura had been taken. The evening sun was streaming through the clinic's wide windows, coloring the walls with warm hues. The usual silence stood in Laura's room, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the medical devices. Paulina sat by the bedside, gently adjusting Laura's hair, which fell in soft strands on the pillow. Her face reflected fatigue and anxiety, but there was determination in her gaze. Dr. Hunter entered the room, his face serious. He was carrying a file folder. Pauline, I've just spoken to the police. Edward will remain in custody until the investigation is complete, he said, sitting down across from the nurse. That's a good sign, but I'm afraid he might get away with it, Pauline said, looking up. People like that always find loopholes. We have enough evidence to prevent that from happening, the doctor said soothingly. But the main thing now is to focus on Laura. Her vitals are stable, and I believe she's fighting for life. Pauline nodded, her lips quivering in a faint smile. There was hope in her soul that this nightmare was coming to an end. Edward, meanwhile, was sitting in the interrogation room. His face was tense, his eyes a mixture of fear and anger. Pauline's notes and witness statements were on the table in front of him. The investigator scrutinized his reaction. Mr. Edward, all the evidence suggests that you intended to disconnect your wife's life support machines. Do you have anything to say? The investigator said sternly. Edward gave a nervous smile. It was all a misunderstanding. I just wanted to ease her suffering. It's the humane thing to do. The investigator raised an eyebrow skeptically. Humane? On the tapes you talk about the inheritance, about being tired of waiting. It doesn't sound like caring, but pure calculation. Edward fell silent, realizing that the excuses were getting weaker and weaker. Look, he began, I loved Laura. I just didn't know how to deal with it all. The investigator cast a penetrating look at him. You knew how to deal with her estate, didn't you? Let's talk about this later. For now, you'll remain in custody. Edward clenched his fists, but remained silent. He realized that the game had turned against him. The situation at the clinic was heating up. After Edward's detention, Laura's parents came to talk to Dr. Hunter. Their faces were haggard, but determination sparkled in their eyes. Doctor, thank you for saving our daughter, Mrs. Wilson said, hugging Hunter. We had no idea he was such a man. We did what was necessary, Hunter replied calmly. What's important now is to focus on her recovery. She has a chance. We're willing to do whatever we can to help, Mr. Wilson added. How soon can she recover? It depends on her body, the doctor replied, pressing his lips together slightly. But there is a positive trend. We have to give her time. In the evening Pauline sat in her small office, looking at the screen of the surveillance camera. She was looking for something that would give her even more confidence in Laura's safety. She knew that Edward was in custody for now, but the anxiety wouldn't let her go. The silhouette of a man in a long cloak flashed on the screen. Pauline tensed. It was one of the visitors to the clinic, someone she had seen several times before. He seemed strange to her. His movements were cautious and his face was hidden under a hat. Pauline decided to follow him. She stepped cautiously out into the corridor, trying not to give away her presence. The man stopped at the door of Laura's room, but did not enter. Instead, he leaned against the lock as if checking something. Pauline clenched her hands into fists, trying to decide what to do. At that moment Dr. Hunter appeared in the corridor. He noticed Pauline and looked at her questioningly. Pauline gestured at the strange man. Hunter, without hesitation, headed towards him. Excuse me, can I help you? He asked firmly, stopping beside him. The man flinched and turned sharply. I just wanted to know where the exit was, he mumbled, stepping back hesitantly. Hunter looked at him carefully, then nodded toward the exit. Straight ahead and to the left. The man hurried away. Hunter and Pauline exchanged glances. Who was that? She asked. I don't know, but I'll find out, the doctor replied, his face wary. Night had fallen on the clinic. Pauline could not sleep, feeling that something was brewing. She decided to stay in Laura's room. Sitting down in the corner, she clutched tightly to the teddy bear her grandmother had once given her. She didn't know that new challenges awaited her, but she was ready to protect Laura at all costs. Time in the clinic seemed to stand still. Pauline, sitting by Laura's bedside, gazed into her pale face. Every time the machines emitted their monotonous signals, she thought it was a whisper of hope. But inside, something kept her uneasy. The disturbing silhouette of the man from the corridor was still in front of her eyes, and it wouldn't let her relax. Dr. Hunter entered the room, closing the door carefully behind him. There was a subtle tension on his face. Pauline, we've established the identity of that man, he began quietly. He's a private detective. Edward had hired him before his arrest to find out what was going on at the clinic. Apparently, he's hoping to find loopholes to get out of this situation. Pauline frowned, her hands clenched instinctively in her lap. But why would he do that? He's already lost, Doctor. We have enough evidence. Edward is a man who doesn't give up so easily. He's probably looking for a way to smear us, or worse, to find vulnerabilities in the case. We've beefed up security on Laura's floor, but I'm asking you to be extra vigilant. If you notice anything suspicious, let me know right away. Pauline nodded, trying to hide the fear that gripped her. She was used to being in control, but now she felt like she was on thin ice. By midnight the clinic had fallen into silence. Pauline, wrapped in a plaid, sat in her corner, but sleep did not come. She listened to Laura's quiet breathing, trying to calm herself. Suddenly footsteps were heard in the corridor. Pauline became alert. The footsteps were too quiet, as if someone was trying not to attract attention. She got up and went to the door, listening. Her heart beat harder when she heard a slight creak. Someone was slowly opening the next room. Pauline cautiously peered out into the corridor. The lights were dimmed, but she could make out the figure in the cloak. He was standing near the door, as if checking something. "Hey," she called loudly, trying not to give away the tremor in her voice. The man turned round sharply, but instead of speaking, he sprang from his seat and ran towards the stairs. Pauline rushed after him. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, but she was determined to find out what the man was doing here. "Stop," she shouted, trying to catch up with him. The figure disappeared round the corner. As Pauline turned to follow him, she was sharply grabbed by the arm. She cried out, but saw Hunter's face in front of her. "Pauline! What's the matter? Why are you screaming?" he asked, trying to calm her down. "There." She pointed towards the stairs. The man was here again. He went into the wards. The doctor quickly looked in the direction indicated, but the corridor was empty. "We'll check the cells," he said firmly. "But you need to calm down. You're very tired, and it's important for us to keep a clear mind." Pauline, breathing heavily, nodded. But inside her, anxiety was bubbling up. In the morning, the clinic lived its usual life. Patients and staff went about their usual business, but the atmosphere on Laura's floor was tense. Dr. Hunter called Pauline into his office to discuss details. "Pauline, I've looked at the CCTV footage," he began, pointing to the screen. "A man did enter our floor, but he didn't touch anything. His actions seemed strange." Pauline leaned closer, watching the suspect's movements. It was as if he was checking the equipment, but he didn't switch anything off. "Maybe he was looking for something to give to Edward," she suggested. "Or maybe he was just trying to scare us," the doctor added. "Either way, we'll beef up security. I'll contact the police so they can speed up the investigation." Pauline returned to Laura's room feeling even more anxious. She tried to concentrate on her patient, but her thoughts returned again and again to the strange night visit. Suddenly her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Do not interfere where you are not asked. Otherwise the consequences will be serious." Pauline turned pale. Her hands were shaking, but she quickly handed the phone to Hunter as he entered the room. "Doctor, it's a threat," she said quietly, showing the message. Hunter frowned as he read the text. "It's Edward. His men are trying to intimidate us," he said, handing the phone back. "Paulina, listen to me. You can't be alone. We'll make sure you're safe." Pauline took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I'm not afraid, Doctor. I just want Laura to be safe." "And she will," he said firmly. "But for that we have to be careful." Night fell over the clinic again. Pauline stayed by Laura's bedside, trying not to think about the strange message. Images of the past flashed through her mind, memories of the first time she came to this clinic and saw Laura. She'd only been an intern then, but a lot had changed since then. Laura was no longer just a patient to her, but someone much more than that. "You have to wake up, Laura," Pauline whispered softly, squeezing her hand. "We can't let these people win." The machines buzzed quietly, and hope flared in Pauline's soul. The night was dark and quiet, but inside the clinic, Pauline found no peace. After the threat on her phone, she felt the tension around Laura thickening more and more. She tried to distract herself by sitting by the patient's bedside, but there were too many thoughts swirling around in her head. Laura looked the same as always, quiet, almost lifeless. Pauline adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and suddenly felt her fingers trembling slightly. It was a barely perceptible movement, but Pauline was sure it had happened. "Laura?" she asked quietly, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer, but that small movement, that tiny reaction gave Pauline hope. Her heart beat faster and she immediately called for Dr. Hunter. "Doctor, I think she's beginning to respond," Pauline exclaimed as he entered the room. Hunter examined Laura carefully, then checked the machines. "Her vitals have changed a little," he nodded, as if to confirm her hunch. "That's a good sign, Pauline. Maybe she's starting to come out of it. But don't be in a hurry, everything goes on as it should." In the morning Pauline left the clinic for a short walk. She needed to clear her head, to collect her thoughts. The past few days had been too hard. She went to the nearest cafe and ordered a coffee. But as soon as she sat down at the table, a man approached her. He looked a little over 40 and was dressed in a gray suit, which immediately attracted attention. "You are Pauline, aren't you?" he asked, sitting down across from her without permission. Pauline was wary. "Who are you?" she asked briefly, trying to remain calm. "My name is Wainwright," the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "I represent Edward. You and I have a common interest in Miss Laura's condition." Pauline clutched the cup in her hands, trying not to sound alarmed. "If you're from Edward, then you know he's not welcome here. What do you want?" The man smiled, but there was nothing kind in his gaze. "I only need to remind you that excessive curiosity can lead to unfortunate consequences. Edward only wants justice, nothing more." "Justice?" Pauline couldn't help but be sarcastic. "You call it justice when he tries to bully us and threaten Laura?" "Laura should have made up her mind a long time ago," Wainwright replied, his tone sharper. "But she clings stubbornly to what is already lost. Think about it, Miss Pauline. You don't want to go up against strong people." The man rose and headed for the exit, leaving Pauline in a state of shock. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone and called Dr. Hunter. "Doctor, I've just met with one of Edward's men. They keep threatening," she said, trying not to let her excitement show in her voice. "Where are you?" Hunter asked calmly. "At a cafe near the clinic. Wait for me there." "I'll be right there." When Hunter arrived, Pauline briefly told him about the meeting. The doctor looked focused, but not frightened. "We'll beef up security," he said. "These people realize their time is running out, so they're trying to act brazenly. But we have evidence, and we will see this through." "Doctor, they won't stop. They have enough money to bribe anyone," whispered Pauline. "Don't worry, Pauline. We'll get through this. Laura is stronger than she looks. And so are you," he added, lightly touching her arm in reassurance. Pauline nodded, feeling a little better. Back at the clinic, Pauline took her place at Laura's bedside again. This time she didn't feel alone. Hunter had promised not to leave her alone, and that was empowering. She took Laura's hand and spoke quietly to her as always. "Laura, I know you can hear me. You have to wake up. We're all waiting for you, and we need you. I promise you, we'll get through this." Her voice was filled with sincerity and hope. And at that moment she felt the faint movement of her fingers again. Pauline smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that everything was going to be all right. Time in Laura's room seemed to stop. Pauline, sitting by the bedside, still held her hand tightly, feeling a slight but subtle movement. It was almost insensible, but it was enough to make a new hope flare up in the girl's heart. "Laura, can you hear me?" she asked in a whisper, not taking her eyes off her face. There was no response. But Laura's fingers twitched weakly again, as if to confirm her presence. Pauline immediately summoned Dr. Hunter, and a few minutes later he was in the room. "She's responding, doctor," Pauline exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. Hunter quickly walked over to the bed and began checking her vitals. A slight smile appeared on his face. "That's a good sign," he said. "Her brain is starting to respond more actively to external stimuli. We're on the right track." Pauline exhaled with relief, but her anxiety still lingered. The threats she'd received from Edward's men continued to weigh on her soul. She knew they wouldn't stop until they got their way. Late that night, when the clinic had fallen into silence, Pauline was alone in her room. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. It was impossible to rest, because every moment could be decisive. Suddenly the silence was broken by a barely audible rustle outside the door. Pauline was alert, her heart pounding. She got up and walked cautiously to the door. There was no one behind it, but her intuition told her that something was wrong. "Who's there?" she asked loudly, trying to make her voice sound confident. There was no answer. Pauline felt a cold fear gripping her. She went back into the room and locked the door, feeling a little calmer. She looked at Laura and whispered quietly, "Don't worry, I won't let them get to you." The next morning Dr. Hunter called Pauline into his office. He looked more collected than usual, but his gaze was intense. "Pauline," he began, crossing his arms over his chest, "I have some news. We've beefed up security at the clinic, but we need to be prepared for any eventuality." "Do you think they might go for something serious?" she asked, her voice trembling. "These people will do anything to get what they want. But we have one thing that could play into our hands," he said quietly and pulled a small tape recorder out of a desk drawer. "What is it?" Paulina asked in surprise. "It's a recording of their threats." One of the staff recorded a conversation with a man who introduced himself as Edward's assistant. It could be important evidence in a court of law. Pauline took the tape recorder and held it to her chest and looked at the doctor with gratitude. "Thank you, doctor. It's very important." Hunter nodded, but his face remained serious. "We must act quickly. If Laura wakes up, her testimony will be crucial. You need to continue to be there for her, to support her. She feels your presence, it helps." That night Pauline sat by Laura's bedside again. She held her hand and spoke to her as usual. This time, however, her voice was not only hopeful, but firm. "Laura, I know you're strong. You have to come back to us. These people can't win if you wake up and tell the truth. We all need you." This time Laura's reaction was stronger. Her fingers didn't just twitch, they squeezed Pauline's hand. The girl's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Laura! You can hear me!" Pauline exclaimed, pressing her hand to her breast. She immediately called for Dr. Hunter. When he entered the room and saw Laura struggling to open her eyes, a smile appeared on his face. "She's coming back," he said. "Pauline, you've done the impossible." But Pauline knew that there were more challenges ahead. The main battle was just beginning. There was a muted silence in the room, broken only by the soft whirring of the medical equipment. Pauline sat by Laura's bedside, clutching her hand, looking hopefully into her face. Slowly but surely, Laura's eyelids fluttered, and then she opened her eyes. Pauline, without restraining emotion, smiled broadly, her eyes filling with tears of joy. "Laura, can you hear me?" she asked reverently, moving closer. Laura blinked, her gaze was unfocused, but gradually she began to focus on Pauline. Her lips trembled slightly, and barely audibly she spoke. "Where?" Pauline clasped her palm, her voice trembling with joy. "You're safe, Laura. You're with us. You're going to be all right." At that moment Dr. Hunter entered the room. When he saw Laura's eyes open, he rushed over to her. "Laura, welcome back," he said softly, checking her pulse. "You fought for a very long time, but you made it through." Laura smiled weakly, her voice barely audible. "Pauline. Doctor. Thank you." Pauline couldn't hold back the tears. She knew it was only the first step, but the important thing was that Laura was alive and her consciousness was returning. A few weeks passed. Laura was slowly recovering, her body was gaining strength, and her mind was becoming more and more aware of reality. She spent a lot of time talking to Pauline and Dr. Hunter about her experiences while she was in the coma. "I heard your voice, Pauline," Laura confided one day. "It was like a beacon in this darkness." Pauline was embarrassed, but her heart was filled with warmth. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation. The evidence gathered against Edward and his accomplices proved sufficient to open a case. The recordings of the threats, the testimony of Pauline and Martin, and the recovering Laura became key figures in the trial. Edward attempted to defend himself, assuring that his actions were motivated by concern for his wife, but the court did not accept his arguments. He was found guilty of attempted murder and fraud. His ally, a private detective, was also punished for complicity in the crime. A few months later, Laura finally recovered. She decided to sell her company and start a new life, free from her past. Pauline, who had become a close friend and support for her, remained by her side. One evening Laura invited Pauline and Dr. Hunter to dinner. They sat on the terrace of her new home, enjoying the view of the sunset. "Doctor, Pauline, you have become more than just saviors to me," Laura began, looking at them with gratitude. "You've become my family." Hunter smiled, raising his glass. "Laura, it was you who taught us that the fight for life is always justified. We are proud to have been a part of this story." Pauline nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Laura, I will never forget the way you fought. You are strong." Laura smiled as she looked at these two who had been there for her through the most difficult times. She knew that with their support, a new, bright chapter of life lay ahead of her. This story was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, you can find light if you have those who believe in you by your side. Thank you for walking this journey with the characters in this story. I hope this story about the power of family, forgiveness, and new beginnings has inspired you and reminded you of the importance of support and love even in the most difficult times. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your impressions and comments. Your thoughts and feedback are very important and inspire new stories. Subscribe and give us a like so we don't miss new stories. I apologize for any errors in the text. Thank you for your understanding and support.